The choking powdery dust of the Mesopotamian plain hung heavy in the dead air, tasting of ash and dry earth, while the rhythmic, metallic scraping of iron chariot blades being sharpened endlessly echoed through the dark. For weeks, King Darius III had ordered thousands of men to literally flatten this specific patch of earth. They stripped away every stone, brush, and uneven ridge to create a flawless, unobstructed execution ground for his 200 scythed chariots. It was a mathematically perfected killing field designed to annihilate an invader. Yet, in one of the most terrifying paradoxes of military history, this meticulously leveled terrain became the exact anvil upon which the 2-century-old Achaemenid Empire was permanently shattered by a vastly outnumbered enemy. If you misunderstand Gaugamela, and you misunderstand the very mechanics of how the ancient world was conquered. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today we dissect the Battle of Gaugamela. But before the first spear was thrown, the battle was almost lost in the chilling darkness of the night before. In the tense days leading up to the clash, Darius attempted to buy his empire's survival. He offered the Macedonian king the western half of his dominion, a massive ransom of silver, and his own daughter in marriage. For any pragmatic commander, this constituted an absolute strategic triumph without shedding another drop of blood. Yet, Alexander flatly refused. When his senior general, Parmenion, advised the acceptance of these terms by stating, "If I were Alexander, I would accept," the young commander clinically replied, "So would I, if I were Parmenion." Thus, this rejection was not born of mere arrogance, but of a calculated geopolitical doctrine. Alexander understood that a compromised peace would leave the Persian imperial apparatus intact to fight another day. To permanently secure his rule over Asia, he needed to unequivocally break the Persian will to fight on an open field for all the world to witness. Consequently, when Parmenion later urged a night attack to neutralize the crushing numerical superiority of the enemy, Alexander dismissed the tactic outright, declaring, "I will not steal my victory." This singular psychological decision immediately inflicted a crippling physical toll upon the opposing forces. Terrified of a sudden Macedonian ambush under the cover of darkness, the Persian command forced their entire army to stand to arms in full battle formation throughout the night. The resulting physical exhaustion was absolute. As a biting desert wind swept across the leveled plains, the heavy, sleep-deprived breathing of tens of thousands of Persian soldiers merged into a low collective hum of fatigue. They gripped their weapons with numb fingers, their muscles cramping beneath stiffened leather and iron scale armor, bleeding their stamina into the dirt hours before the actual slaughter commenced. Conversely, the Macedonians slept securely in their camps and consumed full morning rations. By manipulating his enemy's anticipation, Alexander had already begun dismantling the Persian lines in the dark. But when dawn finally broke, the morning light revealed a terrifying reality that made even the hardened Macedonian veterans freeze in their tracks. Before them stretched a military assembly of a scale rarely witnessed in human history. The Persian line extended so far across the featureless expanse that the Macedonian flanks were completely overlapped before a single forward command was even issued. Modern historians estimate the Achaemenid forces numbered anywhere from tens of thousands to well over 100,000 men, drawn from the deepest provincial corners of a vast empire. There were heavily armored Bactrian cavalry from the eastern steppes, contingents of towering Indian war elephants, and stationed directly in the vanguard, the 200 scythed chariots. Against this sprawling horizon of men and beasts, Alexander deployed a highly specialized, rigidly disciplined war machine. At his center stood the Macedonian phalanx, a dense block of heavy infantry wielding the sarissa, one an 18-foot pike that presented an impenetrable hedge of iron points. Flanking them were the elite Ky The Gioi, the companion cavalry, acting as the primary offensive strike force. But the fundamental architecture of this army relied on secure flanks to protect the vulnerable rear of the phalanx formation. At Gaugamela, the terrain offered zero natural defense. There were no rivers to anchor a flank against, no hills or ravines to block an enemy sweep. The plain was entirely flat, leaving Alexander mathematically enveloped by the sheer geometry of the battlefield. This extreme tactical pressure was amplified by the stark auditory contrast between the two colliding forces. From the immense Persian lines erupted a deafening, chaotic roar, a discordant din of dozens of different regional languages, the blaring of bronze war horns, and the restless stomping of impatient cavalry mounts. It was an auditory assault designed to shatter enemy morale before physical contact. In chilling response, the Macedonian vanguard advanced in an eerie, heavily disciplined silence. The only noise from their ranks was the synchronized rhythmic crunch of thousands of infantry boots stepping in perfect unison, accompanied by the dry creaking of leather straps and the unified clatter of sarissas being lowered simultaneously into offensive position. This was a professional corps operating as a single, lethal organism, seemingly indifferent to the overwhelming mass arrayed against them. Darius had built the ultimate trap, and all he needed was for Alexander to march straight into it. And astonishingly, Alexander did. The blueprint constructed by the Persian king relied on a massive, unsynchronized double envelopment. Stationed securely in the exact center of his vast formation, surrounded by the elite immortals, his personal guard of heavily armed infantry, and hardened Greek mercenary hoplites, Darius orchestrated a battle plan designed to crush the invaders in a tightening vice. His primary instruments of localized destruction were the scythed chariots positioned directly in the vanguard, specifically aligned to strike the Macedonian center. These were not merely transport vehicles. They were ancient kinetic shock weapons, equipped with long razor-sharp iron blades extending laterally from their wheel axles and projecting forward from the yokes. Their sole tactical purpose was to accelerate across the artificially leveled ground to reach maximum velocity before crashing into the dense Macedonian phalanx. And the intended effect was not simply to inflict casualties, but to sever limbs, shatter the wooden shafts of the tightly packed sarissas, and physically rupture the rigid infantry blocks. This violent disruption was calculated to create fatal gaps for the Central Persian cavalry to immediately exploit before the pikemen could reform their ranks. Simultaneously, the vast Persian cavalry wings prepared to execute the grand encirclement. On the right flank, the seasoned commander Mazaeus led a massive contingent of Syrian and Median horsemen, while Bessus anchored the left with tens of thousands of heavily armored Bactrian and Scythian lancers. Because the Persian line extended far beyond the flanks of the narrow Macedonian deployment, these cavalry wings simply needed to ride forward and sweep inward to attack Alexander's completely vulnerable rear. It was a clinical, mechanical strategy of total annihilation. The visual dread of this impending maneuver pressed heavily upon the advancing Macedonians. As the morning sun climbed higher over the featureless plain, it cast a blinding metallic glare across the opposing army. The searing light reflected off thousands of polished bronze scales, freshly honed iron chariot blades, and a literal forest of spear tips, creating a solid wall of glittering hostility that stretched as far as the human eye could process. The sheer visual weight of this overwhelming force, radiating heat and lethal intent, emphasized the absolute tactical entrapment of the Macedonian position and every veteran soldier looking forward understood they were walking directly into a perfectly engineered execution ground. The math was brutally simple. The Macedonian line was too short, but Alexander was about to break the fundamental rules of ancient warfare. Instead of meeting the Persian center head-on, Alexander initiated a maneuver that defied conventional military logic. He ordered his entire right wing, spearheaded by the elite companion cavalry, to begin marching diagonally to the right. This was an extreme high-risk gambit. By drifting laterally, the Macedonian commander was deliberately stretching his own battle line, actively pulling his primary offensive wing away from the secure anchor of the central phalanx. He was thinning his defensive front to the absolute breaking point, effectively risking the total annihilation of his forces in order to fundamentally alter the geometry of the engagement. His target was the rough, unleveled terrain at the outer edge of the plain, the exact ground that Darius had intentionally avoided clearing. The execution of this massive drift was signaled by the rhythmic, heavy thud of thousands of horse hooves abruptly shifting direction in unison. This immense lateral movement violently churned the dry topsoil, instantly kicking up a blinding wall of dust that rapidly obscured the right side of the battlefield. The sudden cloud masked the precise depth of the Macedonian deployment from Persian scouts and added immense tactical pressure to the unfolding maneuver. Watching his perfectly engineered trap begin to unravel, the Persian king recognized the immediate danger. If Alexander reached the rough ground, the feared scythed chariots would be rendered completely useless, their axles and spinning blades snagging on exposed stones and uneven earth. Furthermore, if the Macedonians continued their rightward march, they would eventually slip past the Persian flank, completely bypassing the meticulously prepared killing zone. Forced to react to this geographical manipulation, Darius had no choice but to mirror the movement. He ordered Bessus and the tens of thousands of heavy Bactrian cavalry stationed on his left wing to ride parallel to Alexander's drift to intercept and block the flanking attempt. However, by committing his left wing to a frantic lateral race across the plain, Darius inadvertently compromised his own massive formation. Yet as the Bactrian cavalry pulled aggressively outward to keep pace with the Macedonians, the Persian center was forced to shift and extend alongside them. This desperate adjustment subtly thinned the dense ranks of infantry and horsemen that directly protected the king. Alexander was masterfully using sheer physical movement to force the enemy off their prepared ground. Seeing his prey slipping off the prepared killing ground, Darius panicked and unleashed his ultimate weapon. The command roared across the Persian vanguard, and the 200 scythed chariots surged forward into the open expanse. Accelerating across the perfectly leveled plain, the heavy war carts rapidly reached their maximum kinetic velocity. This was a weapon system built entirely on the psychology of terror. Against poorly trained levies, the mere approach of such a monstrous mechanism would cause the infantry line to fracture, opening the fatal gaps Darius desperately needed. The air was violently split by the terrifying high-pitched whistling of spinning iron blades slicing through the wind, a sound designed to panic horses and men alike as the wall of sharpened metal bore down upon the Macedonian center. But this technology of fear was crashing into the most highly disciplined veteran infantry in the ancient world. Long before the chariots could reach the main body of the heavy phalanx, they encountered a forward screen of Agrianian light infantry. Operating under immense tactical pressure, these skirmishers refused to break. Shouted commands in harsh Greek dialects punctuated the chaos, coordinating a clinical, overlapping defense. As the thundering chariots entered lethal range, the Agrianians unleashed a devastating, synchronized volley of missiles. The result was a sudden, violent crash of heavy mounts hitting the dirt. Javelins found the unarmored bellies of the draft animals and the exposed chests of the Persian drivers. Chariots flipped violently upon their shattered axles, their deadly momentum instantly converted into mangled wrecks of splintered wood, snapped harnesses, and dying beasts. For the handful of chariots that somehow survived this initial gauntlet and reached the main battle line, the heavy Macedonian infantry executed a maneuver of astonishing precision. Instead of bracing for an impact that would surely splinter their sarissas, the phalangites seamlessly responded to rapid horn signals echoing down the ranks. With mechanical exactness, the soldiers stepped aside, actively opening wide corridors within their tightly packed formations. They created a perfectly orchestrated mousetrap. The terrified, often riderless horses, instinctively seeking the path of least resistance away from the solid wall of bronze shields, galloped harmlessly through these artificial avenues. Once the war carts passed deep into the Macedonian rear, grooms and reserve infantry effortlessly subdued the remaining drivers and secured the animals. The ultimate shock weapon of the Achaemenid Empire had been neutralized not by superior armor, but by supreme discipline. The anticipated panic never materialized. The unbroken Macedonian line stood entirely intact, their iron pikes unsplintered, and their formations tight. Darius's primary mechanism for fracturing the enemy center had failed utterly, completely shifting the tactical burden back onto his cavalry. The chariot threat was neutralized, but Alexander's left flank, commanded by Parmenion, was now buckling under a tidal wave of Persian horsemen. While Parmenion's heavily outnumbered left wing fought desperately to prevent total encirclement by the Syrian and Median horsemen, Alexander's extreme lateral drift on the right finally yielded its intended architectural collapse. As Bessus's tens of thousands of heavy Bactrian cavalry raced outward to block the Macedonian flanking maneuver, their sheer lateral momentum caused a fatal disjoining within the vast Achaemenid formation. The Persian center, attempting to keep pace and maintain a continuous defensive front, stretched itself far beyond its physical limits. Suddenly, the devastating consequence of Darius's forced adjustment materialized upon the plain. A distinct, rapidly widening gap tore open between the tightly packed Persian center and their swiftly extending left wing. This was the exact structural fracture the Macedonian commander had actively risked the annihilation of his entire army to create. Without a single second of hesitation, Alexander halted his outward drift. Following a rapid succession of blaring horn signals, he instantly reoriented the elite companion cavalry. Evolving seamlessly from a lateral marching column, the veteran horsemen formed into the emballon, a massive, forward-facing flying wedge. Bristling with heavy 12-foot Xyston lances, this specific cavalry geometry was mathematically engineered to act like a solid bronze chisel driven precisely into a fault line of cracked stone. Supported immediately by the rightmost battalions of the heavy infantry phalanx, who aggressively pivoted from their defensive posture to reinforce the assault, the strike force surged forward. The wedge accelerated sharply, pouring directly into the exposed, undefended seam of the Persian line. Alexander entirely bypassed the general melee, aiming his lethal concentrated formation at a singular, decisive target: the towering royal chariot of King Darius, positioned deep amidst his elite immortals and heavily armed Greek mercenaries. The resulting collision was an absolute triumph of concentrated momentum over static, sprawling mass. Then the concussive impact of armored heavy cavalry slamming at full gallop into the dense ranks of the Persian royal guard resonated across the center of the battlefield like a physical shockwave. It was a localized storm of pure kinetic force. The heavy, sickening thud of war horses crashing into massed infantry bodies was instantly followed by the violent splintering of wooden spear shafts and the deafening, metallic shattering of bronze shields breaking under the immense pressure. The tremendous physical weight of the Macedonian wedge drove relentlessly forward, physically dismantling the protective rings surrounding the Achaemenid monarch. The rigid, disciplined spear point of the cavalry charge pierced deeper into the royal center, cutting down the king's personal retinue at agonizingly close quarters. The sheer tactical precision of the maneuver had completely bypassed the numerical superiority of the empire, reducing the engagement to an unforgiving, localized struggle for survival mere yards from the sovereign. Through the chaos of blood and dust, the two kings finally locked eyes, but only one held his ground. Confronted by the unstoppable momentum of the Macedonian wedge and the rapidly disintegrating wall of his elite guard, the Persian monarch's nerve finally broke. Darius forcefully turned his chariot, abandoning his royal standard, and fled swiftly backward through the collapsing ranks of his own army. The psychological devastation of this single act rippled outward instantaneously. In ancient warfare, the physical presence of the sovereign was the ultimate anchor of troop morale. Seeing their commander abandon the field, the entire Achaemenid center lost all tactical cohesion and rapidly dissolved into a chaotic, panicked rout. Alexander had the ultimate prize entirely within his grasp. The capture or death of Darius would instantly legitimize his conquest of Asia and permanently extinguish any unified imperial resistance. He drove his companion cavalry relentlessly forward, intent on riding down the fleeing monarch. However, piercing through the haze of the battlefield, a desperate rider arrived with an urgent dispatch from the far left flank. Parmenian's forces were on the verge of total annihilation. The seasoned Persian general Mazaeus had successfully pushed his heavy cavalry wings in a massive envelopment, pressing the Macedonian left so severely that enemy units had already breached the rear baggage camp. Here, the supreme test of leadership presented itself. The young king faced a harrowing psychological division: the intoxicating lure of personal glory and absolute strategic victory versus the fundamental grounding duty to the survival of his soldiers. In a defining display of martial discipline, he chose his men. Swallowing his profound frustration, Alexander sounded the recall. The blistering heat of the late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly upon the armored riders, mixing intensely with the pungent, metallic smell of fresh blood, pulverized earth, and lathered horse sweat. Shouted commands demanded an agonizing physical pivot from the exhausted cavalrymen. They sharply wheeled their heavy mounts around, abandoning the pursuit of the Persian crown to plunge directly back into the densest pocket of the engagement. This agonizing return charge, smashing into the rear of Mazaeus' formations, relieved the unbearable tactical pressure on Parmenian's besieged veterans and decisively broke the final remnants of Achaemenid resistance on the plain. The Persian army was utterly destroyed, but the man who commanded them had vanished into the eastern mountains, leaving behind a shattered world. The immediate consequence of this comprehensive tactical collapse was the total capitulation of the Persian imperial core. Without a functioning field army to defend its borders, the immense wealth and regional hubs of the ancient Near East lay entirely exposed. The legendary gates of Babylon, the administrative center of Susa, and the sacred ceremonial capital of Persepolis fell rapidly into Macedonian hands, effectively terminating the 200-year supremacy of the Achaemenid Empire. What replaced it was the forceful dawn of the Hellenistic era, a radical geopolitical shift that systematically spread Greek language, civic governance, and rigid military architecture deep into the heart of Asia. Yet, Beyond its immense political consequences, Gaugamela endures as an immortal masterclass in martial engineering. It remains the supreme textbook example of combined arms synchronization, the high-risk execution of the refused flank, and the clinical manipulation of battlefield geometry to neutralize overwhelming numerical superiority. Alexander had essentially used his enemy's own meticulously prepared terrain against them, proving that mobility and discipline could dismantle scale. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, a heavy silence finally settled over the vast Mesopotamian expanse. The massive clouds of pulverized topsoil, churned into the air by hours of relentless cavalry maneuvers and heavy infantry engagements, slowly drifted back to the earth. This settling dust silently coated the shattered wooden axles of neutralized, scythed chariots, the discarded shields of fleeing provincial levies, and the trampled golden standards of a vanished superpower. The tactical masterpiece was complete, and the map of the ancient world was permanently rewritten. If you want to continue dissecting the tactics that built and broke empires, please subscribe to our channel to relive heroic chapters of history with us.